There we go.
Here we go.
Okay, it is 7 o'clock and we'll open this meeting of the City of Kenmore Planning Commission. The first item of business is public comments, so invite any citizens who are present to share their thoughts with us. Rita, do we have anybody who's available for that?
If you'd like to do a public comment, if you could use the raise hand feature, and then we can promote you to a speaker. I'll give you a couple seconds. We do have some people in attendance. I see no hands being raised.
Okay, it looks like we've satisfied that portion of the agenda. The next item that I have is approval of the May 4th meeting minutes. However, I don't see the actual minutes included in at least the agenda I have. So are those coming later?
I think they're in the packet.
Are they in the latest packet? Okay, I must have been on earlier.
They were in the packet that was mailed out on May 25th.
On May 25th. Okay, I apologize. I guess I haven't seen that latest one. Okay, so do we have a motion for the minutes for May 4th?
I move we approve the minutes of May 4th.
Second.
Okay, any discussion on the motion? Okay, hearing none. Why don't you call the roll? Rita, please.
Tracy Vanazinski,
Yes.
Dwight Thompson,
Aye.
Chair Orenshaw,
I'm going to abstain because I have not had a chance to read them. So,
okay. Commissioner Vanderlyn.
Aye.
Commissioner Greathouse,
Aye.
Commissioner Olson,
I abstain. I wasn't there that night.
and Commissioner Lutzis.
Aye.
okay, it looks like those minutes pass 5 to nothing. So the next item on the agenda is the land use element update, the TOD expansion. So invite in Lori and perhaps Debbie as well to join us for that.
Hey, sorry about that. Good evening.
Okay.
So it sounds like Debbie, I was responding to a text from Debbie. It sounds like she's having a little trouble getting into the meeting. So I will proceed, and I think she'll probably join us soon. And Rita, could you just make sure she's not waiting as a participant? All right. So good evening, everyone. We've spent the last several months talking about background information. We've looked at maps, we've discussed some demographic information, we heard from Joe Minicozy. Anyway, hopefully all of this is good grounding for our policy discussions, and we are really intending to start that this evening. And the way we've structured it to this point is that while we're waiting for the community survey and development of the public participation plan, we thought we would take up some of the commercial area topics. One of those is TOD, certainly, and then the other major one is the idea of a countywide center, which you heard about when we talked about the countywide planning policies. So tonight, we wanted to begin conversations about TOD. That's a Transit-Oriented Development District, abbreviated TOD. And Kenmore has had a TOD in place since 2015, and it's east of 73rd Avenue Northeast and stretches along Bothell Way. It's centered on the current park and ride. The purpose of TOD is actually to provide densities and amenities that support transit. That's the whole purpose of it. So we certainly want to keep the TOD's focus on areas where there is good access to transit, and we can, as a city, support transit and improve transit by improving the densities in the area. So I presented tonight sort of 3 scenarios that we could talk about to begin the discussion for expanding the TOD, which, as you recall, was something that the City Council put on the docket specifically to look at expanding the TOD. Anyway, there are 3 scenarios. They certainly could be a mix and match situation, or 2 of them could anyway. But what I've tried to do is provide pros and cons for each of these scenarios. And I thought I'd just briefly run through those, and then we can begin a conversation. Does that sound good? Does anybody have any initial questions? Okay, well, seeing none. So what are the scenarios? Well, the first one is pretty basic. It's called no change. That's always a scenario that you compare policy alternatives to. That would continue to leave the TOD as an optional overlay. And what that means is someone in the current TOD, and the map for that was attachment 1 to your packet. That's the existing TOD. Someone in that area can either develop under existing zoning, and there are a wide variety of zonings. There's public, semi-public, there's multifamily, there's some downtown commercial. There's a wide range of underlying zonings. Or they can choose to develop under the TOD overlay. The attraction, of course, is that you can get much higher densities, and in some cases higher heights for your development if you move ahead under the TOD overlay. The advantage to the city, of course, is we get those transit supportive densities, but we also have asked that affordable housing be provided. So if you're developing under the TOD overlay, you have an affordable housing requirement, which you must satisfy. So if we were to leave the TOD as an optional scheme, things would continue as they are now. Again, the current boundaries are centered on the park and ride, which will be presumably a sound transit stop for the BRT, Bus Rapid Transit. And the other thing is that we have already analyzed and put in place the multifamily tax exemption in that area. That's an opportunity given to developers to reduce taxes either for 8 years or 12 years, depending on whether or not affordable housing is provided, but you get it even if you're providing multifamily housing, which makes development more feasible. So the cons, and the reason this whole topic came up, is that lower density development is possible. If you choose not to do the TOD, you can develop under the lower density zoning. And that's potentially a problem when you have a transit corridor. And you'll recall we talked about one project that we had thought was going to develop as a mixed use transit oriented development, and instead ended up being townhouses. So right in the middle of the transit corridor, rather than have those transit supportive densities, we're looking at a lower density development. The other thing is that there's not a lot, there certainly is some, but there's not a lot of vacant and redevelopable land in the current TOD. And if you look at the second attachment to your packet, that's a map that there are a lot of things on that map, lots of things going on in that map. But the various colors represent the various zoning districts. Those are the underlying zoning districts. And those are described in the legend. So you can see, I think, like regional business, which isn't currently in the TOD, but it may be pink. I can't quite remember what the colors are. I'll switch to my map and then I can tell you, but you can see the TOD outline is in brown. It starts over on 73rd. And then it goes out, runs along the Tolt Trail. And then if you follow the brown line around, you see where the TOD is. Right, so regional business is in pink. Urban corridor is in brown. There's multifamily there in orange. And then the area that's outlined in black is what the city has traditionally identified as its downtown. So they don't overlap. And at the time the TOD was initially discussed, I think that was maybe even in 2012, The idea was that, well, downtown already has high densities and we weren't expecting bus rapid transit to come to Kenmore. So TOD was not put over the downtown, but just kept farther to the east of downtown. And there is a very slight overlap where the Park and Ride and St. Vincent de Paul are along Bothell Way. Those are also in the downtown, but it wasn't extended to the greater downtown. The other thing is that there are a couple of other BRT stops that are going to come to Kenmore, one at 61st and one at 68th. So it's important to recognize that it's not just now centered on the Park and Ride. Certainly there have always been bus stops there, but this is a more advanced transit. So that is kind of our analysis of the pros and cons to leaving the TOD boundaries where they are. The second scenario we've talked about here is that we could modify the extent of the existing TOD. So in other words, not change the standards. You could still retain it as an optional zone, but you could move it farther to the west along the transit corridor. You could incorporate downtown. You could pick up areas south of SR 522, or you could go farther west along Northeast 181st Street or through the urban corridor. It's called the Urban Corridor West Zone, which extends out along Bothell Way. So the pros of this approach is that it gets to the issue of potentially increasing densities and providing affordable housing along the farther length of the transit corridor. It also retains the optional nature of the program, which gives more flexibility to somebody who wants to develop their property. And it would also expand affordable housing opportunities in the city. The cons of the approach, of course, are that you still don't get those densities you want. There's nothing that says you have to use the TOD overlay. If you do use the TOD overlay, you do have a minimum density, and it's pretty high. It's 60 dwelling units per acre, which is higher than almost any other. It may be the highest minimum. It's certainly the highest minimum. I think it's probably higher than the maximum density in the city's other zones. So you really, if you leave it optional, that's a choice, but you don't get necessarily those densities. And the other con there is that the TOD densities and height allowances, and particularly the height allowances, are higher than, for example, the zoning, community business zoning along Northeast 181st Street. And we wanted to raise this issue because I think several of you were on the Planning Commission at the time, but heights in that area have historically been quite an issue, heights and views. So view protection along Northeast 181st Street, view protection down across SR 522 to the lake. Those have been sort of major zoning incentives over the last several years, and I explained what those were in the staff memo. So a third option, and this is no surprise here, this is the one that staff is recommending, is that the TOD standards be modified, that it no longer be an optional choice, but would become the actual zoning, and that the boundary should be expanded. So once you eliminate the optional nature of the TOD, then the potential problem of having low density development along your transit corridor is eliminated. Now you would get the densities that you were hoping for. That would support transit. It also would improve affordability. Again, that affordability requirement would come along with that. And you'd be able to tackle this larger supply of vacant and redevelopable land outside of the current TOD boundaries. The cons is that you lose the flexibility. So a developer would no longer have a choice to determine whether the TOD was appropriate for their property. It would be a mandate. And the other thing is that this would be a fairly complicated process. It's not that you could just move the TOD overlay, for example, over the downtown zoning. There are a lot more standards that go along with some of these other zoning districts. So really at the point of implementation, writing the zoning code, which is not what we're doing, at this point, we're just identifying through the comprehensive plan where we think these TOD boundaries should be. You would really have to do a zone by zone review. You may have to create a new zone. It's called the TOD zone. But for downtown commercial, maybe what you do is you pick up the density requirements. And you may want to modify the heights. For example, in downtown commercial, you can already go to a higher height than 65 feet, which is the TOD height. So it would be a more complicated analysis and preparation, but I think the outcome would be better. So again, I've already spilled the beans that staff is recommending that it should no longer be an optional zone, and that some of those requirements would be incorporated either into existing zoning districts or into a new zoning district. But the one thing that we also want to recommend is that it not actually, the TOD not be expanded to the west of downtown. So that's certainly picking up the areas south of Bothell Way. So picking up Lake Point, picking up Plywood Supply, those two big mixed use master plan areas. Picking up downtown, which makes sense, but not extending into those areas where height has been such an issue. It seemed that the return that would be achieved by bringing up those height issues, which have been so important to the community, would not be worth it. And with that, I'm trying to think if there was anything. Oh, the other thing is, and we wouldn't, again, this is an implementation measure, but once revised TOD or TOD standards are put in place, it may make sense to expand the multifamily tax exemption to the areas that have been identified as TOD. So the rest of the staff memo was really background information. You can see all the different zoning districts that are covered by the current TOD and that could be covered if the TOD were expanded. So I've provided the basics there. The TOD standards are in the first column, and then the other information follows. So with that, I will ask if you have any questions or reactions.
So Lori, I just have a question about the underutilized and vacant properties graphic. So my understanding is that all of the areas that are outlined in red are redevelopable lands.
Right, so that work was done actually by a firm when the economic development study was updated a couple of years ago. So they did an analysis, and it was based on sort of what was existing on a property and the square footage value of that versus the value of the property itself. And so these were the parcels, and the report itself breaks it down into much more detail. There were sort of 3 tiers of potential redevelopable property. And so these were the parcels that they identified. And by the way, if you were to look at the Lake Point site, all those funny angle, that has to do with GIS and the way the various layers were created. So no, the parcel lines, there is not a line that crosses the little inlet there by the north side of Lake Point. Some of the parcel lines are accurate, but they're not exactly right. And again, it's a fact that the different layers were put over each other and they weren't all calibrated exactly right. So I'm having our GIS consulting assistants fix that, but I didn't have the map ready for this evening. I don't know if that was part of your question, like what are these?
Yeah, so then I was just kind of wondering if these are areas that, for possible redevelopment, why haven't they been redeveloped yet? Is there would it help if we change the TOD, or are there a myriad of other reasons they haven't been developed?
You know, I think that the latter part of your comment is what it is. There are a myriad of reasons. So for example, if you were to look at the parcels not in downtown, but to the east of downtown along Bothell Way, there are so many private ownerships there that parcel aggregation has been a big issue that different folks who have analyzed the economic situation in Kenmore have flagged as a potential problem. So one is property aggregation. The other one may be that both Plywood Supply, which is on the east side of Juanita, and Lake Point, both of those have large mixed-use master plan requirements on them currently. So those are all under single ownerships, but they have extensive development requirements. And in fact, the Lake Point sign, as you probably know, has gone through a number of developers trying to make it work. We had a study when we looked at regional business zoning several years ago. There was a study done that said sort of that Kenmore is not ripe for office development, that it's just not here yet. So it's a market issue. In terms of the zoning, I think, I'm not sure that there's, in fact, we had another consultant who had done some work with Nancy Owsley, the assistant city manager, on some economic study work. We asked her to go through the code and say, are there issues here? We were speaking specifically of office development. We were saying, are there issues in our code that we don't recognize that are discouraging economic development from coming to Kenmore? And she said no, that she thought our code looked really, really good. It's very liberal in terms of uses, except for industrial and heavy manufacturing uses, which are not permitted anywhere in Kenmore. So I think it's the market, it's the parcel assembly. I think it's that some of these properties are large and under a single ownership, and a master plan, which is a multi-year intensive endeavor, hasn't been taken up yet. I mean, those are some of the things I'm aware of.
Okay, thank you. That helps a lot.
Add a little local color to that, having sat through those discussions. As I recall, correct me if I'm wrong, Debbie or Lori, when we brought in some of the folks who were owners on those properties and asked them some questions, especially Plywood Supply, what we discovered was a number of those larger parcels are sites for ongoing businesses that people have no intention of closing down. So, I mean, they kind of takes out several of the very larger, already consolidated parcels. It makes this much more difficult to work with. That's kind of where we left it the last time we looked at this. But now I'll ask you my question. We're talking about the multifamily tax exemption, and we're also talking about the potential under the TOD to get enhanced height and density. Could you talk a little bit about how those interact? Do they overlap? Are they complementary? How do those work together, particularly if we were to consolidate into a larger TOD?
So they're not the same thing. So the TOD deals exclusively with building form, parking, tree growth preservation, height, etc. And then the multifamily tax exemption relates to property tax. And it's a completely different section of the municipal code. And there's an analysis done to look at what the impacts would be if you were to give this exemption. And so it is an incentive to make financing new development more palatable. So they don't really cross over, except they're both dealing with sort of the same product, which is multifamily development.
Yeah, and that actually gets closer to my concern here. If we were to consolidate or kind of expand the TOD, and you have both incentives out there related to allowing greater height for larger development in return for providing affordable housing. And then we also have tax exemption that's provided for providing affordable housing there's a lot of incentive on the table here, which hasn't worked so far. So I'm wondering just, maybe we need to take a look at both of those too and say, is one of those sufficient? What do we get for one? Do we really need both?
Well, I think, again, I think they're enough different that they're not doing quite the same thing. They certainly are both incentives. But for example, if you said, okay, we don't want to expand the TOD, but we want to expand MFTE, you might encourage multifamily, but you're not going to get the densities that's the transit supportive part that you're interested in. On the other hand, if you do the TOD and then you don't approach the question of MFTE, that's the way it was in the TOD when it was initially approved. And we had a couple of developers say it's not enough incentive, and that's why the whole study was done to put MFTE over the TOD area. But I do think that, you know, the charge here is to think about sort of the densities and the expansion of the densities with affordable housing. And then as an implementation measure, the analysis would be done to look at the impact of MFTE. What would be the cost of doing that? What would be the implications for the city, for example? It's a whole different type of analysis, one that I have not done. But I would suggest that we should first focus on whether the TOD should be expanded for the reasons of density, et cetera, and leave the MFTE farther down the road. It would be something that would be an implementation to say, look at MFTE and see if it makes sense.
I understand what you're saying, and I think probably, yes, we have a zoning question first and then the question of incentives. But I think they do in some sense go together. Particularly when we think about what are we trying to get out of a rezoning or expansion of TOD. So I would like to have some more information before we came down to a decision on just which incentives, what are we incenting with one versus the other? And how does one get to our desired goal? And do we really need to have both? You've got two, again, you know, what we talked about before, we've got two, not necessarily competing, but we got two very different objectives here. One is to increase density, and one is to provide affordable housing. So understanding what incentives we're providing and what it incentivizes, so we can look at our priorities a little more clearly would be helpful to me anyway. Thank you.
Go ahead, Dennis.
My question still focuses on the second aspect of the tax exemption. I'm wondering how much effort it is to sort of take a current inventory of how much taxes are paid by this whole area. And then, I don't know if you can predict or not, but if you take that away, what does it do to the other tax-paying owners? Is it a major hit on them or minor?
Yeah, the analysis itself that is done before you apply MFTE is extensive and very complicated and looks at that type of an issue. I really want to encourage you to step back. We're not really talking about applying MFTE at all at this point. What we're looking at are the land use standards, and if the land use standards are changed and if those incentives, for example, were not working, an implementation measure that could be identified in the comprehensive plan would be to say, if these, you know, if we're not getting the desired result, it might be worth looking at expanding MFTE over the balance of the TOD. MFTE and TOD don't go together. They're completely separate things. And so the TOD can be moved and adjusted without ever considering MFTE. And considering MFTE is not part of what we'll be doing with this project. The only thing it could be would be a consideration for the future if another incentive is needed.
Thank you.
Looks like Dwight had his hand up first. Go ahead, Dwight.
Well, not to belabor a point, but the MFTE is of concern to me because if you take for Dennis's point is that if you're taking the funds away that used to be there, that's a problem. But what's worse is the issue of density, because density brings more city services, and if the tax money is not being collected to help pay for those services, I think we have a concern. But I would agree with Lori that we need to take this one step at a time, but I think there's two sides of the coin here, and that is higher density does create more need, demand for city services, which are expensive, especially for police and other types of code enforcement and public works. So that is of concern to me. I'm just kind of taking this in. I'm a little confused between what would be the impact if the TOD encompassed the downtown zoning area. So, and the second point is that, when I looked at that map and saw the plywood business, I thought to myself, they'll never sell, because that is such a key location, because location, and it would be, where else, where would they relocate? I was just running through my mind, where would they have a space that large that they could relocate doing the business that they're doing? And then there's the pub crawl, the tavern crawl down the trail, and several of those places are identified as red boxed, and I could see like what the city accidentally tried to do with that one public works yard. I could see it now. It'd be a mess. But anyway, those are just some thoughts.
Right. Yeah, the zoning, the higher density zoning has been in place on both Plywood Supply and Lake Point since incorporation. But certainly the owners have expressed interest in retaining that higher density zoning, but have not expressed any interest in relocating at this point, at least Plywood Supply. Lake Point, I think, it continues to hope for a mixed use master plan. And the other thing I would say is that the vacant and redevelopable map is what it is. It was an analysis done a couple of years ago. Nobody is suggesting that property owners should sell or that they have to sell or do anything like that. If again, what we're looking at is if development should occur, if a property owner does wish to redevelop, should we continue to allow this optional approach, or should we say, if you're going to redevelop and you're going to provide housing, you have to provide a certain minimum density. We'll give you a great amount of density increase, and once we do that, we can request affordable housing.
So Laura, Nathan, you're next, but Lori, just to kind of follow up on that point. So you're of the opinion that increased density will, all other things being equal, sort of tip the scales for redevelopment of the type we're talking about? Is that really the crux of?
I'm not sure it will.
Versus an optional. So I'm just curious how, your thought process and maybe Debbie on that.
I'm not sure it will tip the scale to make someone decide to sell their property. Mm-hmm. But if someone does want to sell and redevelop their property, it would require them to provide a transit supportive density.
Mhm.
So they could not do a low density residential development in the heart of the transit corridor, trying to move away from that. So nobody says you have to redevelop, but if you do redevelop, we really want a higher density there. We need that to support transit.
So I think that's the question that the Planning Commission needs to really focus on, is what they see for the 522 corridor. And think about that. And sort of don't think about the individual properties or what they are right now. Just think about, based on the corridor that's there, does it make sense to have higher density there to support transit? I mean, that's sort of the basic question. And then everything else flows from that.
Nathan, go ahead. I know you had a question or a comment.
Yeah, I did have one question that came up when I was looking through this earlier, and that had to do with parking for the TOD. That was one thing that stuck out to me when I was looking over the charts and compared to the other zoning districts, is I know that parking has been an issue in Kenmore before. I've heard it come up in different council meetings and whatnot. And so I was curious to know if there's some projected impact of, if, say, for instance, we do require the TOD and make it a new zone or something like that. With the current parking, I guess, situation going on for that zone, what would be the impact on the city? Because I mean, we have, a minimum density of 60 units and a max of 150. That's a lot of parking. And we can hope that they'll use public transportation. But I mean, we do live in a country where, most people have cars. And I'm just curious, that's one of the things that stuck out to me, was what kind of impact we could expect by making the TOD, a zone.
Right. So the parking in the TOD is reduced for sure from the regular standard. And the other change there is that you can sometimes, not always, sometimes consider street parking for your use. And I think that gets to the notion that during the evening, for example, when people may want to be at home, perhaps nobody is using the street parking, and that, so there might be some balance there, but it would certainly be a balance. The idea, parking standards for areas that are close to transit have been the subject of much study over the last probably 10 years. And the general consensus is that too much parking is provided. So you end up with surface parking lots where nothing can develop, that eat up valuable real estate. And that really the people who should be deciding how much parking should be on a site are the people who are building the site, who are going to have to answer to their tenants. And if there is a need for parking, regardless of city standards, they will provide the parking that is necessary for their project. So a couple thoughts. Certainly the analysis of parking and parking adequacy is something that, as we move ahead to look at the plan, would be considered on many different levels. The second thing is that parking standards along transit corridors typically are reduced, and the city already does that for some types of housing. And third, then there's the question of whether the city wants to mandate a parking level that may be overkill as these higher density developments along the transit corridor come to be. So those are my thoughts, but they're certainly valid points. Parking is a key issue.
Okay. No, all that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think it would be important, to keep it on the back burner as we go through this, if that's the route we decide to go. But no, that all makes total sense. And I think that's something we can discuss later, if that's kind of the path we choose.
Hi, Dennis.
What degree are the transit stations committed? For how long?
Our what? I missed the word.
How long will the transit stations remain can they change their mind, stop having bus service?
No, because it's not traditional bus service. It's bus rapid transit, which is sort of the bus equivalent of light rail. The stations are built a different way. The service is provided a different way. The headways are very short. And, you know, this was part of the Sound Transit package, much as a light rail line was part of the package that went to Shoreline and now to Linwood. This BRT route that goes from Shoreline through Lake Forest Park, through Kenmore to Bothell is the same thing. It's not like you can just abandon it. It's not like changing a bus stop. So I would assume if the BRT goes in place, it will be there until the point that rail replaces it.
Excuse me, Dwight, one question follow up on that. So I think I read somewhere, maybe it's in one of the city materials, that the BRT stations in I think it was in Kenmore may be delayed until maybe 2029. I didn't think that was a final decision yet. And I think it was 2024 to 2029 was the at least the
Right.
the potential. And obviously,
Yeah.
you know, we're doing long-term planning, but I wonder if that has any effect, you know, that potential 5-year delay in actually getting BRT in terms, especially in terms of, you know, how developers may look at this. Does that have any, you know, measurable effect on redevelopment interest by developers?
I suppose it could push out the interest a little bit, but I mean, sometimes it takes years. The existing TOD, again, has been in place since 2015. And we're waiting for a project. I mean, something similar could happen with other TOD areas. And you got that exactly right about the whole realignment process and how maybe BRT is coming in 2029. Although there's a big push, you all should be pushing to get it to Kenmore in 2025.
Right. That's above our pay grade, I think, right? That pushing, right? So.
No, I think they're very happy to hear from residents.
Go ahead, Dwight. I'm sorry.
So another topic, just to throw this out here. I think several of us have probably seen that Sound Transit has sued City of Lake Forest Park for lack of appropriate zoning and development ordinances. So if we don't quite meet the grade on some of what we're discussing here, is it possible that we could end up in the same kettle of fish as Lake Forest Park is? Now, I know that they have that issue's a parking structure too, but I think they've gone a little bit further than that even. But I wanted to understand what Debbie and Lori, what you think about. I'm sure you're watching this with bated breath.
Debbie, do you want me to speak to it, or do you want to?
No, there was an appeal. So Lake Forest Park recently adopted standards for the center, including parking structures. And there was an appeal to the Gross Management Hearings Board by Sound Transit, sort of appealing some of those regulations. So it's in appeal to the Gross Board, and the hearing is coming up at the end of September. So that's what's going on in Lake Forest Park. Very, very different situation in Kenmore. We already have requirements in the TOD, and for the project for Sound Transit could certainly be permitted under the current regulations. So it's very, very different. If you change regulations, I mean, again, when you change regulations, there is always an opportunity for somebody, if they so desire, to appeal to the Growth Board. But they have to have valid reasons, and then the Growth Board will decide, and they can either, overturn the ordinance or remand it back to the local government. So I don't know what will happen in Lake Forest Park, but it's sort of a different scenario in Kenmore.
Go ahead, Tracy.
In thinking through the packet this week, I was actually mostly thinking about like what's our broadest vision for that area, and what kind of zoning, what kind of TOD zoning would fit that broader vision. And I feel in general, like theoretically supportive in principle of expanding the TOD along 522. I feel like that's an area where we have a lot of concrete, like a lot of actually parking lots, that maybe that's not the highest value use of that land that we could get out of it. And again, I'm thinking back to some of the things that Joe Minicozy talked about. And so for me, that seems like an area that is, I think that it's worthy of another look and of an expansion of the TOD to see if we can make better use of some of that land there. That said, I think like where the boundary should be is something that I personally would want to be very careful, cautious, and thoughtful about, because when I look at the map that was in our packet, like we actually have a lot of critical areas in that area, and some of it's from Swamp Creek coming down along 73rd and then over to 80th as it goes, meets the Sammamish River, and then some of it's actually from Quetzalcoatl, which is the little stream that comes down 61st, and then the wooded ravine that's there. So when I'm thinking about where development has gotten us, like what our patterns of development have gotten us, where they've gotten us in terms of the climate crisis that we're in, and what we've done to our environment, I feel like I want to be very cautious about those areas. And probably there are some areas where we have developed and we should pull back if we can, or we need to exercise a little bit of restraint. So I want to be thinking about that when I'm thinking about the TOD, and also just development in general. And also in terms of climate resiliency, which I think we have to think about for our community, I think we need to make space for our waterways to take on a little bit more of their natural functions. And I think, again, to me, that means maybe pulling back from them. So while like in general, I feel like the idea of expanding the TOD kind of fits with a vision for where we can put some density, I do want to be very careful about where that is and not just simply plop it down over like where we're already developing, or maybe even where the existing TOD is. Those are some thoughts that I had about it as I was looking over the packet and the information that you shared with us.
Go ahead, Mike.
Uh, Getting back to, I think it's Tracy's helping us go down the path Debbie was trying to get us to look at, which is what is the wider vision. I'll share my thoughts on that. I think concentrating a multifamily high density along 522 makes a lot of sense. Where I tend to stumble is two places. One is just how deep should that be? On the south side, I don't have any problems with the lines that are drawn there. As you get further north beyond about 181st, 182nd, I get a little concerned about, do we want to have a blanket 60 R60 sort of zone there? Or do you have some sort of a graduation as you go through it? I think I'm still concerned also about the cost of these developments here, and long-term what the cost to the city would some of these be. And I'd like to understand that a little better as we go along. In general, what I'm, having been involved in the creation of the current regional business and some of the urban corridor designations we have up there already, what's coming to my mind now is the need to maybe rethink that. We were thinking about commercial development in there and trying to encourage a lot of commercial development as well as multifamily. But it seems like we're going more toward residential, which may be a more pragmatic thought for the future in planning, given the way the economy is going, particularly in terms on the retail side. So in short, yeah, I think along 522, that's where we want to put it. I think having incentives that allow for development of affordable housing is part of that. I think that's very important as well. The one really second piece that I really stumble over is I hate the TOD designation. Has transit-oriented district. I thought we were trying to plan for people, not buses. And so I get a little concerned about that. We're doing all this work so we can have bigger buses rolling down our street. Not the message I think we want to send. And so it may be kind of a strange way to look at it, but I would like to see us maybe reorient some of our conversations to how does this enhance people? How do we get back to Kenmore's livability and being a quality place to live? I don't think you do that by trying to maximize throughput through the transit system. The transit system is a way to enhance perhaps the livability for people who are here. We need to reverse that around. So I'd rather have a pod than a TOD. Thank you.
Mike, I really love that because I feel like we're going to do much better in our visioning if we're thinking about what people need. And I do feel like as part of climate resiliency, we need to be focused on public transit and things like light rail. But we also really need to be focused on designing spaces that people can easily move in and that are scaled to people. I think one of the things that I don't like about what we're currently doing is that a lot of our development, I think, is not at all scaled to people. And I think you can feel that when you're walking around, and it makes it harder for people to navigate. So I appreciate those comments. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And when I think about this, and a solid development of 60, a density of 60 per acre throughout that whole area, what's that look like? What does that feel like? It doesn't seem to me that that's going to be very livable. So I think having some more gradation to this and thinking about, well, maybe we don't want all high density up to the 60 level, but we want some sort of more human focused, or that looks more comfortable for people to live in. We may be creating kind of a urban landscape within our city, recognizing what the future is probably going to be like anyway. But I think there's probably a way to do that, to scale it in such a way that it still retains some of the character and livability of Kenmore.
And then also kind of dovetailing with something that you brought up, Mike, I wanted to circle around back to my comment about what I wanted to be careful about. I want to be careful not only about the stream that comes down 61st and Swamp Creek, but also the Sammamish River. And so I actually would feel personally right now uncomfortable extending the TOD all the way south of 175th for that reason, because I think the Sammamish River needs more space. I would really love to see us pull something together where we can get more value out of the land that we are developing so that we don't have to develop it all or develop it all so intensely. So that's part of why Joe Minicozzi's presentation excited me so much, because I could see some possibility in there. Like, I don't know how to actually execute that, but if we could get more value and make our city financially healthy through developing less land in a smarter way, I think we could really preserve the natural features of Kenmore that everyone loves. I think most people who live here love our natural open spaces and love the trees. And then I think that also will provide some climate resiliency for us to just kind of circle back around to that, which we will need. We're already feeling the effects of changing climate. We're going to feel that more and more as the years go on. I think we need to develop smarter because of that. So I don't know how to do it, but I'm excited about it.
Well, you got me excited. So I'll throw out one idea. We're putting incentives in here for affordability, great cause, for increased density to improve our economy and lots of other things. When you look at some of these developable areas here, as Tracy pointed out, and you can see that some of them are at least partially composed of natural areas, or what could easily be natural areas. I wonder if we can incorporate an incentive program that would incentivize those property owners as they develop those areas to set aside separately, maybe even deed back to the city in some way, or at least some way preserve and conserve those areas, concentrate the development in the particularly as you go south of 175th, there's some usable, developable land there. But if we could draw a line around those natural areas and use the incentives that the city could provide to incentivize the landowners to either deed back or otherwise preserve those areas in return for a break on developing the rest of their land, I think that'd be worth thinking about.
Go ahead, Nathan.
Lori, could you quickly expand upon the element within the grid on the agenda for TOD about tree protection being more? I think that's related to this conversation, and I think it would be beneficial for us to have, you know, an understanding of what that means.
Right. So since there are different components in all, or different aspects to zoning in most of these zones, if there's a whole chapter on tree protection, and if you have to comply with that chapter and that chapter only, I considered it base. You had to comply with the base tree regulations. If you have to do more than, or you can do more as an incentive, then I put more here. So you were specifically asking about less, which is in the downtown commercial zone, the tree standards don't apply in the same way. And the idea really was that if you're developing a downtown, tree preservation would be difficult at best, particularly if you don't have any setbacks and you're sort of creating that streetscape of building walls. So the downtown tree standards are less than in other areas. In the TOD, on the other hand, I had indicated more because you have an incentive. If you can preserve a tree grove, then maybe you either get more units or you have to provide less parking. So more tree preservation is encouraged. And then the same in the downtown residential, I think that is also exempted, that particular zone. Again, it's a downtown zone, exempted in the zoning code from having to comply with the standard tree regulations. That help?
Thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you. Yeah, I think that does help. And I think, you know, standardizing the TOD and making that, you know, required going forward, I think that would be a great element to keep, that, you know, there's the potential and encouragement for more tree preservation within it.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Ruthie.
This is related to Nathan's question. Thank you for bringing that up, Nathan. I also was wondering about that. So, but is tree grove, I'm curious about, is that different from a tree grove? Does that have what's the definition of a tree grove?
Okay, it's actually defined in the zoning code, and I think it's 2 trees or more. Hold on a minute. I'll have to pull out it's actually in the TOD chapter, which is in an earlier, one of your earlier packets, but it'll be fast.
I figured there was a definition.
So look it up. Yeah, there is a definition. I think it's 2 trees or more.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a grove. I always think it should be 3 trees, but I think it's 2 trees.
So
If it's 2 trees, I don't know what they did over by the church, but there's a lot more than 2 trees that was cut down, and there's nothing left.
That's not in the TOD, so it's the standard rules. But in the TOD, if you have a tree grove, a significant tree grove shall consist of 2 or more trees with a minimum of 5 1/2 tree units total. So they have to be of a certain size. And if, despite the fact that you're doing this higher density mixed use development, if you preserve the tree grove, then again, you can either provide fewer units or have a parking reduction. It's an incentive beyond the standard tree requirements.
Okay, that was another one of my questions. So it doesn't apply to just a single tree. It has to be 2.
Well, the tree grove benefit does.
Right.
The underlying tree regulations apply on all properties except, and again, I think it's just downtown commercial and downtown residential.
Yeah, and the idea of it being an incentive, I I wonder, like, how often has it worked, that incentive to preserve our trees? I'm curious about that.
Well, we haven't had a TOD development, so
Yeah.
I don't know whether this incentive has worked
Mhm.
or not.
Right. Right.
Well, we're not so sure if there's any incentive at all anywhere else.
Right.
Yeah.
I know you've been concerned about that, the tree issue up by the church, and the city council, I'd have to look up the meeting date, but they had a very, very extensive presentation on tree preservation. It was like an hour plus on how the city handles trees on development sites. And I think that's a really good grounding in sort of the basic tree requirements of the city. And I'm happy to, I can send a link to that out if you all are interested in sort of the basic tree requirements.
I would appreciate a link to that specific hour because I have looked for it and have not been able to find it.
Okay.
So I, for one, would love some viewpoints from that hour.
Yeah.
What's the rationale for going with an incentive to preserve trees rather than a straight up requirement to preserve them?
I wasn't a staff on the TOD, so I don't know exactly what the discussion was, but I assume it's because this is an area where we're expecting higher density development. And as you can imagine, there's always a tension between preserving trees and getting higher density development. That higher density development takes up more space. And so if you have a tree in the middle of your site, it's going to be very hard to do your high density project and preserve that tree. So it was a way to say, if you have trees beyond just the basic requirements, we'll try to give you an incentive to reduce your parking, and maybe you'll put a little cutout in your building. I'm not sure, and maybe Debbie, I don't know if you can speak to this. I wasn't part of the group that looked at the TOD, so I don't know what the tree growth preservation thoughts were.
Well, I think it's making it an incentive. It's sort of, if you preserve a tree, you get something beyond the basic tree requirements, you get something in return. You might be able to get more units. So it was making it an incentive because you would get more. So if you preserve the tree, you got something in return. If you made it a requirement, then it's maybe not always applicable on a particular site. I know when this came through, looking at where the TOD was applied, they were sort of saying, well, some of those sites along the corridor which have large parking lots, for example, there's quite a few trees there. So if you want to try and retain them, let's make it an incentive that those existing large trees would be preserved.
Mm-hmm.
And you would get something in return. That was the basic thinking.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. I mean, that logic does make sense to me. I'm just trying to like puzzle out what all options might be and what would be most optimal for us given our values and goals. I do, again, this is something that I don't know, like I don't know from experience how it would work, but I do know that there is a tension between density and tree preservation. Like again, I come back to the example of New York, where you have, like, it's just all very densely developed. Like, of course, if you're gonna build that densely, of course, you're not gonna be preserving trees. But I just wonder if there's a way to think about it differently. Like, I just wonder if we can think about how can we develop more densely, and also preserve our trees. Like I don't know, like, I don't think we have to be New York, like that was one way of building and developing, and that happened. And I love New York, actually. I think it's a fantastic place, but I don't know that the time going forward from now forward, I don't know that this is the time for everyone to be developing exactly that way. And I just would love to kind of think like out of the box and think about what's our vision for, like, to just like think creatively about what's our vision for what we can do, like what's possible, like what have we learned from the past, what's been good that we've done, what's been not so good, and how can we take the good parts moving forward. And so I just would love to think about like developing more densely and also preserving our trees. Like, what would that look like? that kind of feels exciting to me.
Well, the way I think about it, and this is just my perspective, is that by developing density in places like Seattle and Kenmore and Bellevue and replanting small trees when we can, we are preserving the great mass of trees out beyond the urban growth boundary. All the way across the Cascades, we are preserving trees, unlike so many places that don't have a boundary. And there are no trees because they've developed clear over to Yakima.
Yeah,
I mean,
and I actually am a believer in that too. Like, I believe that we need to, I said this last meeting, like I believe that there's value to that urban growth boundary. And I've seen, like, I was sitting in a presentation where somebody showed a project in Shoreline where like 2 trees got cut down, but like hundreds of people could live there. And then a project out like, I don't know, say it was in North Bend. It wasn't in North Bend, but it was out that way. And it was like they clear cut a whole lot of trees and to put in these big mega houses to house like fewer people than they'd house in Shoreline. I don't want that to happen. And I think that what we can do in Kenmore can stop that from happening. And still at the same time, our watershed here is important. Our environment here is important. Our trees here are important. And I feel like I just would love to figure out a new way to live with nature, even in the urban growth boundary. Yeah, I'm not advocating for no development or allowing sprawl to happen. I'm just wondering if there's some new way we can approach this. I would love to hear other people's thoughts about this. I'm gonna stop talking.
Well, if no one else is going to chime in, I will. I can always count on that. I think concentrating on what we can actually control and where we actually have some range of motion is probably key here. I frankly don't trust that the urban growth boundary is really going to have the intent that it hopes it will. Yeah, I'd like to preserve the rural areas and small farms and trees and everything out and forest out there, but I'm really thinking about Kenmore and how do we maintain the livability of our own city. And I think pragmatically, as you increase density, you are going to lose trees. We are going to lose trees. I mean, that's a fact. So what I'm looking for is how do we manage that in a way that we can maintain and create some additional livability. Preserving 1 or 2 trees at a time may be it, but maybe if we can find some ways where we've already got some substantial amounts of natural areas that are out there and relatively untouched, concentrating on those areas and using whatever funds we can come up with as we allow increased densities to manage and conserve those properties going forward, we can I think we get a better chance, a more pragmatic chance of retaining some of the livability and feel of the city that I think we all like to have. It's a hard thing, but I think that's the reality. If we must get thicker, if we must get more dense, it's going to cost us something. We just need to figure out how do we preserve what we can and maintain it going forward. And I think there's ways to do that. But we've got to think about the whole thing together.
So Lori, is there something you need us to decide on tonight?
Well, I think, and I'm not sure you're ready. If you have a sense of, just even the answers to some simple questions, should the TOD be expanded? Should more area be covered by the TOD? If we had an answer to that, or should it become a mandatory requirement versus an optional requirement? I certainly don't want to get into the nitty gritty of, well, how many units and what should the minimum density be? At a broader brush, is this style of development, more housing with affordable housing, something that you would like to see more of in Kenmore geographically, and whether or not it should be required? Those are the kind of the 2 fundamental questions.
Okay, do you want us to vote on those or what?
Well, it depends on if you're ready to vote on those. If you want to vote on them, sure.
I think it's either that, or maybe you can, Mark, you can kind of help the commission see if there is sort of a consensus in an approach for those bigger policy questions. That would be super helpful.
Well, yeah, I mean, to the first one about the vision of increasing, increasing density. I mean, I haven't detected that there's any, real opposition to that. Is that a fair assessment from from the group, not just from tonight, but from prior meetings? That seems to be a kind of a baseline consensus. Is that fair? Anybody have other opinions on that?
That statement is fine. There needs
It's
to
pretty
be-
general and pretty broad, but that's what you're asking for, Lori, right? So.
So exactly how far that density went, that would still be an open question. But just the idea of more density there in general is what you're asking
In the
about.
downtown area, extending the TOD as staff has recommended. So what was your second question? I'm sorry, I had to go get my my adapter to make sure I didn't lose power again. So, so what was the second?
Yeah, can I ask a follow-up question? So you've said the notion of expanding the TOD, although where the boundaries would be is still an open question, but staff has recommended that it not go west of downtown because of the height considerations and the view considerations. And I'm interested to know whether the Planning Commission is ready or able to make a recommendation on that, because that will influence the next set of analyses that we do.
Well, I think Mike was, and maybe I'm not sure if others were at that time on the commission when this was a huge issue in, what was it, 2013 or 2014. And I think that's, basically already been litigated and pretty much resolved that we want to preserve view corridors in that area. So from my perspective, just me alone, I would certainly support that limit on how far it would be extended west. So.
I would agree. Let's not reopen that can of worms. We may come back at it someday, but we don't have to do that now.
Yeah,
I agree.
We have enough on our plate.
And I would say that's true. It doesn't preclude coming back in a future year to see. I mean, but if you do expand the area, you are then expanding the opportunities. And if we still need more, we can do that in the future. So you can always go back and change regulations later.
Again, a pragmatic approach. I think that works. I'd like to suggest maybe just a nuance of the way we talk or think about this is, I know why we're saying we're talking about wanting to expand the TOD. Rather than saying that we're going to look at expanding the TOD, I think I would prefer to say we want to look at the zoning and land use requirements within this footprint and think about it in terms of the priorities that we've created. And we not automatically say, okay, we've got a TOD, we've got TOD rules, and we're going to go back and maybe look at how some of those will get pushed or shoved. But I'd rather take a more of a level approach, a ground floor approach, and look at the whole area and think about how the zoning might change throughout the entire area.
Now, when you say the entire area, what do you mean the entire area?
I'm thinking about the footprint that Lori and Debbie has laid out for us for what's now being called the expanded TOD. I'd rather not call it an expanded TOD because I'm not necessarily interested in expanding all of the components that are built into the TOD throughout the same footprint. I'd like to go back and look at each one of those and think about this more as not a transit-oriented district, but as where we're going to site, take advantage of the potential for higher density and maybe set more affordable housing. That's really our goal. I don't really all that wedded to buses. Not that I'm against buses, but I don't think that's what we're really trying to achieve here. So I would just like to, instead of talking about expanding the TOD, we're talking about how do we use the land within this zone that's been laid out in a more thoughtful way.
I would like to add that we should also be considering what we're doing to our business base. and what, by designating land to be used for residential development, what's the give and take of what we're doing with our business growth and those requirements of the Growth Management Act and those that will be handed down to us from King County. I'm not saying I'm against the residential stuff. I'm just saying I think we need to be a little educated in what the requirements are and what we're giving up with residential land.
Yeah, one component of the TOD is that it's not except in zones because it's optional. It's not, you can't do standalone residential. So it would never be a case where the residential would completely eliminate the potential for commercial or office uses. It has to be mixed use. So I appreciate what you're saying, and I certainly don't think we'd want to go in the direction of allowing a standalone residential project in these areas.
There's a big difference between commercial, things that produce jobs versus, things that are more restaurant and service oriented types of job. Those don't create new jobs. They don't produce. They're not like manufacturing or things like that. So, it's just a thought. I just think we need to, because if we don't think this through, the council is going to definitely want to think it through.
Speaking of education, one question I was wondering about if there are other, comparable cities that have expanded their, original TOD, and if we have any lessons potentially learned from those. Again, comparable type sized or.
Yeah, I'm not sure. There are lots of communities that have sort of this transit-oriented development, and that's just what it's called. And I appreciate Commissioner Vanderlind's idea that really is it transit-oriented development anymore. But I don't know that, every place is so unique, and we're not talking about a station area. I mean, we're having stops, and there's going to be a parking garage, but that's not quite the same as a station. So I think the answer is, I don't know whether there are other comparable ones. I mean, there's certainly a lot of literature about transit-oriented development and minimum densities, and I think probably that was the focus of the work that was done in 2012 when the whole thing was first taken up, and maybe there's some background there that I can look to see if there's anything that would be helpful.
Yeah, if there is something again that's applicable that might help us as we're kind of working through this.
I think what I'm, again, bigger picture envisioning in that area is something like what Joe Minicozy showed us in those maps where he showed the bars spiked way up I think they were in the downtown cores. That's what I am seeing in my brain for that area. So I'm not actually thinking about it so much as a TOD, something that's, we're just building for people to get on buses. Like I'm thinking of it as something like that's a really strong, like financially strong, people oriented, and by people oriented, I mean like people can walk safely, people can walk to services, people can walk to, get a coffee, get a pint of milk. People can, I think too about design standards a little bit, which I don't think we've really brought into any of our discussions, but you can design something like that in a way that still isn't people focused. Like people could still walk and do all those things, but it's still not designed at a people scale. Or you could design things at a people scale. And so that's sort of what I have in my head. Is that far off from what everybody else is thinking or what staff is thinking?
Well, that's good.
I'm right there with you, Tracy. As we're thinking about expanding the geography of this beyond the original TOD, I think it requires us to take a more extensive look about how we're going to use this expanded area. It's more than just high density residential to surround to take advantage of a high transit location. As Dwight said, I think you have to think about commercial, you have to think about this being a community. And that's more than just a question of how dense is it going to get, or how are you going to incentivize some diversity of the population in terms of affordable housing. And I always am leery of expanding scope because you could get killed with it. But I don't know how you do this, blow this up to the size that we're talking about without getting into a wider thoughts about how this land is going to be used and what the flexibility it is, and maybe even to some of the design issues.
I think I see where you're going with this, but I think you really have to, when you're looking or creating a zoning district, you're looking at what the purpose is for. So for example, and I'm going to use the downtown because it's the easiest one. When downtown was created, the purpose there was pretty darn clear. It had to be a place for people to gather and people to live and people to work. And that was sort of the highest sort of policy dictate for the downtown commercial, and everything else kind of led into that. I think what you're struggling with is what is the purpose of the TOD and what purpose does it serve overall, and maybe how it relates with those other zoning districts, because you can't have every single zoning district be the same purpose. So that's why you have zones, because they all have a different purpose and a different focus. So I think maybe, and if I've got this wrong, Tracy, please tell me. But I think that's what you're really struggling with. That you want to make sure that the TOD serves a purpose, which is, as Mike says, not just transit, but that it's livable, it's walkable, and it maybe relates in a slightly different. It's something different than maybe the downtown is, and that's what I think we're trying to figure out what that is. What purpose is it?
I don't know if I would have said it exactly that way, but yeah, maybe I am wondering what's the difference between the TOD and like downtown. Why?
I'm wondering, just from my perspective, listening to you all talk and you talking about those maps, Joe Minicozy maps, it gets back to that question about why the TOD was never expanded over downtown initially. And it may be that that initially it was a different animal. It was a park and ride for a bus system. And now it's something different. Now it is a stop, along with a stop downtown, on a bus rapid transit system. So that the two, the theory of downtown and the theory of TOD are closer than they were in the past. And maybe they're not quite so different. Maybe it's a way of thinking about downtown as being like, we have downtown and then we have downtown residential. Maybe we have downtown and then we have TOD that's part of downtown, but it's not kind of the heart of the community, but it offers many of those same benefits as downtown. I think I made it worse.
Well, no, I'm starting to wonder if maybe we don't want a bigger TOD, maybe we want a bigger downtown.
Or they're the same thing.
They might be the same.
Maybe they're the same.
I think that's what you're trying. I think that's what you're trying. From what I'm trying to put it in sort of land use terms. So and I'm not doing a very good job of it, so I apologize. But that's what I'm trying to do, is put some of these conversations in sort of land use terms and how we can use that to develop sort of policies for the comp plan that will then lead into regulations. So that's why I'm sort of struggling with this, so that when we come back at the future meeting, we can kind of frame some of the discussions that you've had, some of these policy questions that you're raising.
I think I'm getting your direction here, Debbie, and I'll take a risk here and throw this out. When I think about this area and I think about downtown. What I keep doing in my mind is blowing it up to the rest of the city. And the real contrast isn't necessarily between downtown area and this new area, but it's really between this concentrated area and our single family neighborhoods. We're building something that's more urban, more dense within our city that contrasts to what 80% of the rest of our cities like. And so we're doing something, we're looking to do something here that's different, that takes advantage of the availability of rapid transit, takes advantage of the location related to our current urban core, and is really looking at how do we grow that urban core within the city. And we're creating some land use that will allow that to happen. That's where my mind is going. And when I think about it that way, it becomes much clearer in my mind. This is not, we're creating something that's markedly different from the majority of the city. It's really more urban. It really is an expansion of the downtown and the urban center. And that's what we're really trying to get at here. The question is, so how do you do that in a thoughtful way? I'll stop.
Go ahead, Nathan.
I guess my kind of interpretation and understanding of the TOD is kind of like a phased area in between almost the downtown and the residential, although probably closer to the downtown than residential, of course, you know. But I don't see it as being maybe exactly the same. I see the TOD, you know, being targeted and focused density building that can help us reach our affordable housing goals just outside of the downtown. I don't see it, you know, incorporating large office parks or maybe extensive stores and shopping centers, but maybe, you know, the multifamily and affordable housing that we need within the city concentrated around the park and ride and the transportation that we have there and that we have coming as well, because we have to keep that in mind. Like Lori and Debbie were saying, you know, there's more stops that'll be coming to Kenmore. And I guess it's just my thought that, you know, if we have to increase density and focus it somewhere, you know, if not here, then where do we put that density? How do we handle that? How do we meet our goals of affordable housing? We haven't met them yet, and we're very far behind, and this would be one step in helping us to achieve that. And so I guess that's just my take on it, is more of, you know, residential multifamily complexes and uses that can help us achieve those goals at the same time.
I'm really interested in that. And I'll just, again, thinking of zoning districts, we have the downtown zoning district, and then we have a downtown residential zoning district. And I think, Nathan, what you're saying is maybe the TOD is kind of more like a downtown residential zoning district that butts up against downtown, but is more focused on residential than on commercial, something like that.
So maybe like a I don't know, something kind of in between, but closer to downtown, like a downtown urban residential. So it's not quite downtown residential. And I guess my take on this whole thing is I see the need and I see the benefits to requiring a TOD district, although I'm still uncertain about expanding its borders. I'm kind of carrying back and forth, and I think the commission feels the same way. We're uncertain about expanding the borders of it, but maybe having it border right up to the downtown district or the downtown zone, but not maybe absorb that as well, and keeping them separate. Because I mean, it's always easier to expand later than expand now and try and retract it later.
That makes sense to me. I really am not thinking in terms of taking the downtown standards and carrying them across to this new expanded area. I do see these two being complementary, but I think the area we're talking about right now is going to continue to be predominantly residential. We need to think through how do we create opportunities for commercial growth in there and for service growth within that area to serve the population that's there. But I do see this area as becoming much closer to the urban and supporting that urban core and taking advantage of the services that are already there and enhancing than it is necessarily other parts of the city.
I completely agree. That's exactly what I was trying to get, as you so eloquently stated.
So when you think back of the missing middle requirements, there is a big piece of that that we could achieve here.
Exactly.
Thinking about it, yeah, it doesn't have to be R60 all the way across.
Mhm.
How do we create some segue, some gradation into this so that we can achieve our goals, but keep the standard, again, to a human livable level?
Mhm.
I feel like this is all opening up some issues that we talked about when we first started talking about missing middle, which is like, where does equity come in? What's the most equitable way to distribute housing in our communities? Using a climate lens, like what types of housing are going to make us most climate resilient into the future? Things like that. And it makes me feel even more uncertain that I have a direction on the questions for tonight.
Well, I certainly was not expecting to get into the missing middle discussion.
We had to go there eventually. So.
Right. So I think basically what I'm hearing is the notion of somehow modifying the TOD, perhaps to incorporate some of its standards into the downtown, perhaps not to incorporate all of its standards into the downtown, but have the two zones complementary. I think I heard that there was a concern about extending it south of 175th because for environmental reasons, at least along the Sammamish River side. And I heard that increasing the density should be talked about in terms of livability, and that we need to think of this not as an area focused so much on transit, but as focused on the people who live there who may be able to take advantage of the transit. So that's what I heard. And I heard that there is support for not making it an optional zone, but really writing the standards into the code so that we don't have this optional thing going on out here where somebody could really do a low density development. Did I catch all of that, or what did I miss?
Go ahead, Nathan.
Oh, I was just going to add on to one of the last points you stated, kind of clarifying my thinking, because I discussed making it kind of standard, writing that into the zones that are there. And I just wanted to clarify my thinking. As of right now, we have this TOD overlay on top of zones, and it's giving developers an option to pick one or the other. And I think standardizing it and choosing one, either the TOD and making those kinds of standard within the zones there, or not, would be probably the best way to standardize the growth of that area. And so I believe it's, I personally think that might be the best way to go it's already there as an overlay, but just making it standard from here on. It's been there for 6 years, kind of like an optional pilot program, just kind of transitioning into that next phase.
Nathan, just to clarify, you're talking about just keeping the TOD as it is, but making it non-optional. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes. I have not discussed about expanding its borders.
Yeah.
So far, I'm uncertain about that. It sounds like, we're not quite there. We need to weigh the benefits and the cons of that. But as of right now, just making that kind of a more permanent feature.
That was one of the options that we were given, right? Is that what?
Kind of option two.
Option
it
two.
Was.
Oh no, because that was modifying the geographic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Aren't we a little early in making choices and in that much of a decision down the road? At least I feel very or the downtown or merging or unmerging and all of these other issues. It's a little, to me, it feels very, I mean, I'm comfortable with that. We need to do something. Absolutely. But the other thing that I'm concerned about is there's got to be a give and take. So I'd like to see what we're going to, if we have increased density, which sounds to me, in my experience, means less environmental protections for this area, then I want to see what's the, if we're going to take here, I want to see what the give is in the rest of the city so that we are assured that things are going to be different in other parcels throughout the city. And if we're going to make it a little easier in this area, maybe that's what we need to do. I mean, Tracy, I'm with you on the protection. I don't, but what I mean to say is that we got to give a give and take here. We can't just keep taking, and there's got to be a line drawn somewhere. And we talked about this several meetings ago. Where are we going to draw this line of density? And this is really what we're talking about here. So I'm supportive of moving ahead and looking at the picture of the downtown. I generally understand the concern about view issues to the west of town. I got that. And then other than that, I'm not really ready to go much further than that for myself.
Yeah, I don't think that we would be expecting to draw the lines or do anything like that at this point. I think what we're trying to do, I mean, we're talking about a lot of details. When we're talking about the comprehensive plan, we're going to be pulling back and saying, generally, this is how we view these areas. And so there's more discussion certainly to come, but when we get to the policy level, that's when we'll begin to talk about how we are going to describe these changes that could happen with future zoning. I don't know if that helps.
I think it does help, Lori. Kind of where I'm going with this or thinking about this is I think we're beginning to recognize that our current zoning groups don't work for us for the future. And so we need to think about this differently. We need to do something different. The boundaries that we've drawn on the map right now, I think, lay out a reasonable area to be able to think through how things might look different in the future. We don't need to draw those lines right now exactly, but I think there is those policy discussions, what we need to get to after we recognize, yeah, there needs to be something has to change. And it's probably going to involve this area in some way downtown.
Mm-hmm.
I think a potential approach we could take is, you know, you gave us 3 options that that city staff recommends is maybe an option 2.5 or something, not quite 3, but maybe a little bit more than 2, where it removes the optional nature of TOD and makes it required, but doesn't quite expand its boundaries. I mean, I'm open to that discussion later, but from what it sounds as of right now, it doesn't sound like there's a lot of us on board with expanding the TOD.
I think this is premature.
For my part, I feel like without being out of bounds and with due respect to past decision makers, I personally feel, I would feel like I would want to take another look at the current TOD boundaries. I personally would want to know, again, I understand the reason because we talked about it and I got a really good answer from staff about why it extended so far up 73rd. But again, I would want to take another really thoughtful look at why it's extended into those R1 areas, which I'm sure are R1 because they're supposed to be protecting Swamp Creek. So yeah. I personally would want an opportunity to take another look even at that.
I agree.
Yep. You know, personally, I think I could become comfortable with expanding our zone of interest here. And I think moving away from optional to more hard-coded zoning is probably a better way to go in the future. But there's some detailed pick and shovel work to be done before you get to that.
Mhm.
And so I think we could probably come to, we want higher density along Bothell Way as we look at some of the sensitive areas. We're real careful about that. As we get into what is now R1 or other low density residential, we're looking at something else there as a potential. We don't want to rule out what's there or that even necessarily staying the way it is into the future, but we create some options for something like a missing middle sort of development in those areas. But that's pick and shovel work, which we'd have to get to. Well, we're not there yet.
You guys really want to get into missing middle. It's we're not.
No, I like to
we're not
just take it
quite
off the
there.
table and not never think about it again. But we're not going to get allowed to do that, are we?
Well, I think it's, again, I think it's a question of the idea you brought up for missing middle was sort of a transition area from the downtown to the single family, rather than, and doing it citywide. And that's definitely one approach. But I think even with that, I think that I don't know what to call this now. I know you were kind of. I'm still going to call it TOD because that's what we've been talking about. I still think that is going to be probably a higher density than what missing middle would be. So again, I still think you could still think of TOD in those broad terms about where you might like to think about higher densities. And then when we come back to think of missing middle, then, maybe that's creating another band or another kind of zoning area for missing middle. But I kind of hesitate to sort of mix and match because I don't think missing middle and this level of density are one and the same.
Oh, I don't think we're, I think I agree with you, Debbie. I think we're thinking the same way. I'll stop saying missing middle because I think that's a confusing, that wasn't fair for me to throw out there. What I really was thinking is more in terms of rather than have this zone all be set aside for very high density, that you have some mix or some banding that allows there to be, for instance, higher density along Bothell Way, but then steps back to lower density behind there. What that looks like, what those bands look like, whether that's even a good idea is a topic for conversation. But I think I would like to see us get away from something like the current TOD, which really encourages or is trying to incentivize the highest density growth everywhere within the district. I'd like to see it have some sort of option in here, particularly if it goes larger. If we didn't increase it much more from what it is right now, it wouldn't be such a big deal. But to the extent that we expand the area geographically, I think we have to allow, I would prefer to see us allow a wider mixing or banding of different types of development, and not all be very high level, high density. I don't know if that makes you feel better, Debbie, or not, but.
I think what I don't want to put Laurie on the spot here, but I'm going to.
Oh, okay. Oh boy, I can hardly wait.
I think
this will be good.
This has been a great discussion along TOD, and what I want to make sure is that does Laurie feel that that we've got enough to go on to bring something back in the future? So that's why I'm just going to ask Laurie that, so that have we got enough response tonight to move forward or not?
Yeah, I think so. I have written down several points. I think I know where the concerns are, and so what we'll be, or what I think we'll be doing is capturing sort of broad outlines of these questions. Next week we'll talk about the countywide center, and maybe that's going to refine, or your next meeting, that's going to refine a little bit more how we see this central commercial area growing. And then, so we'll take that, and then as we move into the fall, that's when we really will begin the missing middle housing discussion. And with these broad policy outlines, then we can begin to put some sort of flesh around the images. We'll work on a vision statement and then identify where in the city we think certain things should be happening. And I will say that we've talked about the comprehensive plan, and Kenmore's comprehensive plan is extremely specific, so that the comprehensive plan map and the zoning map are identical. And that really, a comprehensive plan is supposed to be a vision for the future with broad outlines of how development happens, so that rather than get down to the dwelling units per acre, maybe we're going to say this area is set aside for low density, and this area is set aside for moderate density, and this area is set aside for high density. And here's where we want our downtown to be, so that it's a bigger picture. So we have that broad vision. And then the implementing zoning, which is what sets out the specific standards, is another exercise, and a very specific exercise. So I don't want you all to be thinking we're going to develop new zoning for all of these areas. What we're going to be doing is talking about our vision for these areas, and then where we can capture specific code language that we really think has to be fleshed out before we can move forward. We can handle it that way.
Lori, can you remind us of our timeline, when we would be thinking we are expected to provide something as a deliverable to the city on this?
Yeah, so the land use and housing elements, the target is that by spring of 2022, we'll have a recommendation.
Okay, so we've got time to wade through all of this. We're not going to parse it out in terms of.
Right, and we are not, we're not talking about transportation yet. We're not talking about these other elements. What we're talking about is what are the pieces of land use and how do they fit together? And how are we going to address housing?
All right, well, anything more for us tonight? It sounds like no, but I wanted to double check with Lorraine, Debbie.
The only thing that I was going to mention, I think you all received an invitation from an organization called NUSA. It's the North Urban Human Services Alliance. And it was an invitation to a presentation, I think on June 11th, where they were going to be talking about the relationship of ARCH and how where the ARCH structure fits with the North County approach to human services and housing, that kind of thing. Although they invited you all, we have confirmed with the assistant city manager, who's kind of our ARCH representative, that you should not feel any pressure to attend that meeting. There's a city council representative, I think, who is focused on that. It's a different work group. And the invitation was extended as a courtesy, but I wanted you to know that there was no expectation that you would attend that meeting, unless you have a general interest.
Is it something, Lori, that you feel could inform our thinking here? Or
no, I think it's pretty much focused on sort of interjurisdictional working relationships.
Okay.
Do you agree, Debbie?
Yeah, I think that's what it is. So I don't think that there would be a product that would come out of that would come back to the Planning Commission for discussion. But again, if you have general interest in housing and how those different groups work together, I guess we say you feel free to go, but you don't need to go and then expect that something will then be coming back to the Planning Commission.
Okay, well, anything more for us tonight then? Sounds like that's all we got, right? Okay, so we'll see.
Sorry, Mark, could I say one more thing? I just wanted to say that I acknowledge that email that we got from Jim Howard.
Right, former planning commissioner.
Oh, really? He was so thoughtful. And I just wanted to do that because in my experience as a resident communicating sometimes with council, is like I send something and it feels like it goes into a black hole. So I just wanted to say that I read it, and I'm sure that you all did read it, and I appreciated the feedback, and I'm happy for more engagement. That's all.
Good. That's a really good point, Tracy. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, well, I think that's it for tonight. We'll see everybody in a couple weeks, and this meeting is now adjourned. So good night, everyone.
Good
Hi,
night.
everybody.
Right.
Good night.